What up, leaders? Welcome back to my channel. Today I want to address a question that some people have been raising in the comment section of the last video that I made on the GDP. In other words, some people think that the GDP comparison is not really useful, that what I ought to be comparing is the GDP per capita. That is the gross domestic product divided by the population. And if you compare GDP per capita, then you get a much more even comparison across countries. So what I'm going to do today is to calculate the GDP per capita for Guyana for the next year, and then for 2025 and 2030, and compare that with the GDP for the same countries that we compared in the last video. Okay, so what's the GDP per capita? Well, the GDP per capita is the GDP divided by the number of people in the country. Currently, we can say that Guyana has about 800,000 people living in the country. Now, we know that the last census puts the figure somewhere around 780,000, but since then there has been immigration. A lot of people have moved into the country. A lot of people have come into the country, so we're going to say 800,000. And if you divide the GDP for the next year, which we calculated to be $17 billion, you divide that $17 billion by 800,000, what you get is $21,500 per annum. In other words, the average Guyanese, or the per capita GDP, should be about $21,000 per annum, given the population and the GDP for the next 12 months. Now, where does that fall in comparison to the other countries in the list? Well, we only have 2020 figures. So for 2020, the GDP per capita for Jamaica was around $4,600 per annum, compared to Dominican Republic, which was about $7,200 per annum. For Trinidad, GDP per capita was about $15,300 per annum, $15,300 per annum, which was similar to Barbados at $15,100 per annum for 2020. And for that same year, 2020, Guyana's GDP per capita was $6,955 per annum, compared to Suriname, which was about $6,491 per annum. And for the larger countries in that comparison, which we did last week, 2 weeks ago, the USA in 2020 had a GDP per capita of $63,500 per annum, compared to Canada, which had $43,300 and change, and the United Kingdom, which had $40,200 and change. So that is the ballpark. And if you add Singapore, which we said was aspirational for Guyana, and the United Arab Emirates, for Singapore, GDP per capita in 2020 was about $59,797, right? About $60,000 for Singapore. And Hong Kong was about $43,000 per annum. And for, Hong Kong was about $46,000 per annum. And for the United Arab Emirates, it was about $43,000 per annum, right? With Saudi Arabia coming in at $23,000 per annum, and Qatar coming in at about $62,000 per annum. So that's the spread. The question is, where does Guyana fall given the growth expected in the next several years, and given the high price of oil going forward? So, as I said, the growth, Guyana's GDP will grow by about 50% for the next 2 or 3 years consecutively, right? And it'll probably remain pretty high in the teens or 20s, perhaps even as high as 40 or 50% for the rest of this decade. But what that means is that by 2025, the GDP for Guyana will be somewhere around $32 billion in 2025. Right? So that is, if you multiply 17 billion by 1.5 twice, you will end up somewhere in the 30s, around 31, 35 billion dollars. And that gives us a GDP per capita. In 2025, the GDP per capita for Guyana will be about $47,000 US. All right? Now, at the end of this decade, ExxonMobil plans to produce 1 million barrels of oil per day. In other words, they're going to ramp up production until it gets to 1 million barrels of oil per day. Currently, it's about 340,000 barrels of oil per day. And I explained how that results in Guyana receiving about $2 billion US into the Sovereign Wealth Fund every year, annually. But as you go to 1 million barrels of oil per day, when you calculate what that means for the GDP, it puts the GDP from oil itself, just from oil, at about $41 billion per annum. That's the total economic output from the oil and gas sector will be about 41 billion US dollars per annum. And in that same time period, if you calculate just a reasonable growth in the rest of the economy, from right now where it's around 5 billion to 10 billion by the end of this decade, then you can see the total GDP will be somewhere around 52 billion, I would say 52 to 55 billion US dollars per annum. That means that by 2030, Guyana will be earning over 52 billion US dollars per annum. And that means that if you divide that number, 52 billion US dollars per annum, by the total population, let's say it's about 800,000, that gives us a GDP per capita of 65,500 US dollars per annum. So in 2030, Guyana's GDP per capita will be 65,500 US dollars per annum. That is higher than the US, higher than Canada, higher than the United Kingdom, higher than Qatar, higher than Singapore, higher than the United Arab Emirates, higher than Hong Kong. 65,500 US dollars per annum by the end of this decade, by 2030. So that is the comparison of GDP per capita, guys. For those of you who thought that a per capita comparison would be much more useful or relevant, Guyana's GDP by the end of this decade will be 65,500 US dollars per annum. And currently it's at about 21,000 US dollars per annum. 21,000 US dollars per annum means that it is above all of the Caribbean countries at this point. For the next 12 months going forward, Guyana's GDP per capita is higher than Trinidad and Tobago, higher than Barbados, higher than Jamaica, higher than Dominican Republic, and higher than every other Caribbean country for the next 12 months. 21,000 US dollars per annum. 65,500 US dollars per annum by the end of this decade, and $47,000 per annum by 2025, which means that it will be higher than both the United Kingdom and Canada. So that is where we stand with the economics, guys. Guyana's GDP per capita is rising fast, and it will soon be the highest not only in the Caribbean but in the world. Want to see more content like this? Click like and subscribe. In the comments below, tell me what you think about my calculation. Make your own calculations, compare it. Remember, those of you who are commenting, make sure you come with receipts, right? We need to see references and calculations to back up your contradictions. If you're criticizing my work, come with better work, okay? So that's what I have to say, guys. GDP per capita is growing fast. It's going to be $65,000 per annum by the end of this decade, and currently in the next 12 months it's higher than Trinidad, higher than Jamaica, and higher than the rest of the Caribbean going forward. Share this video with friends and family around the world. Let people know what's happening here in Georgetown, Guyana. Later!